So the subalpine zone is at 10,500 feet, and it's populated by shorter trees, usually of three types. There's going to be subalpine fir, some spruce, Englemann spruce, and whitebark pine. This is where the whitebark pines actually are in their prime habitat, and they are the ones that produce the best pine nuts in the Wind River Mountains and at this latitude. It's a very high elevation pine tree. These limber pine or whitebark pine nuts are the favorite protein source of grizzly bears, but they don't produce every year. And of course, grizzlies don't have to have them produce every year because the way they get pine nuts is by digging up squirrel caches. And squirrel caches often have pine nut reserves that go for several years. But humans usually collect the pine cones, and the sheep eaters lived at this elevation in the summer, the mountain Shoshone. And they ate bighorn sheep, but they also apparently used a lot of the whitebark pine nuts to eat. And this is what they look like when they're ready to harvest. We looked at them earlier in the cone. This is the whitebark pine cone. But when they're ready to harvest, they're covered with sap. And if you're not wearing gloves, you're going to get very sticky fingers. So the best way to deal with that is periodically clean your hands with a rag soaked in gasoline, which is the best way to get rid of that sap quickly. But since the sheep eaters didn't have gasoline, they probably used juniper berry water, which is boiled juniper berries in the green phase, and that makes a solvent for resins. And hot water with juniper berry would have been a way to clean your hands. But these cones were put around fires, and that would open the cone and you can get the seeds out. So again, that's a 5-needle pine. It looks like limber pine, but it only grows at high elevations. And they often grow in threes. They come off of a stem, 3 cones. And you could see 2 of them here. Often 1 or 2 will get knocked off and you'll just see what's left. But that's kind of an odd growth form. But a tremendous protein source. Here you can see how resiny it is trying to open one that's not been heated by a fire, which you could do also and eat the pine nuts directly from the cone. But you'll get a lot of resin with it. And it's okay. As a quick way to get some complete protein, it's a good thing. This is a mountain camp of Washaki's band right here near Atlantic City. It's about 5 miles from where we happen to be right now on Willow Creek. And this is the traditional place that the Eastern Shoshone went to gather pine nuts. This photograph was taken in 1870 by William Henry Jackson, who was traveling through and documenting the gold rush that was going on about 3 miles downstream. The town of South Pass City was being built, and there were thousands of gold miners there. But they were still coming here in September into this traditional Shoshone pine nut gathering area on Willow Creek. So another thing you can get from pine trees, in this case, this is kind of out of sequence for some reason, but this shows a squirrel midden, a red squirrel midden below some whitebark pine trees, and it's all been disturbed and tilled up by bears digging, because that's how they get the pine nuts. That's how I get pine nuts after watching bears do it. It's a very efficient way to get pine nuts they've already been stored underground by a squirrel, and they taste better after they've been under the ground for a while. Around the edges of that pine midden, or that pine nut midden, you can see the ground cover at the subalpine elevation, which is a type of huckleberry called Grouse Whortleberry. And on a good year, those plants will be heavy with red, tiny red huckleberries. It tastes like blueberries, but they look red and small, and you have to spend a lot of time collecting them, but it's worth it. And they were used, they could be dried and pounded into pemmican, and a dessert was made from them with a thickener of biscuit root flour, much like the goatsip, chokecherry pudding. So these berries can be preserved, and they're high in vitamin C and very tasty. But they also have an antioxidant in them that is used to strengthen the retina of the eye. So it was collected, the leaves were collected as an eye medicine, made into a tea. And it's one of those that's considered an old people's medicine. As you get older, your eyesight can be minimized, and you could even go blind. And I think the blindness they were talking about that happened in the old days was treated by this is actually macular degeneration. So these leaves, especially later in the summer, are high in an antioxidant that we mentioned earlier is in hawthorn called OPC, or oligomeric proanthocyanidin. And that is very strengthening to the capillaries in the retina, at the back of the eye. And it's the weakening of those capillaries when they start to get rigid and leak that is responsible for the drying out of the back of the eye and eventual macular degeneration. So this was used to prevent blindness and to treat blindness in old people. And I don't know if I have a close-up of that little ground cover, but it's a very low-growing huckleberry, Vaccinium scoparium, and locally called Grouse Whortleberry. So one of the other things you can get from pine trees is pine bark beetles, which are a naturally occurring infestation that hits pine trees. Whitebark pine trees are getting hit very heavily with those now. And bears will peel back the bark and lap up the grubs of those beetles. This is a high protein source. And people did too in the old days. I've done it when I've been through parts of the forest like this, where there's a heavy infestation. You could peel back the bark because the grubs, the little larva stage of the pine bark beetle, pull away and eat all of the inner bark. There's nothing holding the bark onto the tree anymore. And when you peel the bark back, all these beetles fall down to the ground. And if you have a tarp there, you can collect them and just eat them raw. They're very tasty, with a slight spice of pine sap. And for people who don't like to eat things that wiggle, I have served them to people fried up, and they like it because they're not moving anymore. So it can be fried or raw. But you could see where bears take advantage of that, and they will strip the bark off of these trees and eat the bugs. Little tiny beetles. So this is a huckleberry called thin-leafed huckleberry, which grows right at the top of tree line, right at about 10,500 feet in this area. It grows under whitebark pine trees and under subalpine fir trees. And they are prolific producers of wonderful purple berries. And about every 5th year, they'll produce a bumper crop where you can go up. If you know that they're producing, you can come up with lots of people in buckets and just collect lots of these huckleberries. They're delicious. And probably the best tasting berries we have in this northern Rocky Mountain area next to serviceberry. I think they're comparable to serviceberry for sweetness and flavor. Now we're above tree line in the alpine zone. When you're in this alpine zone, walking around, as I spent a good part of my life, I did a lot of work with mountain sheep for half of my career, and they like to live in the alpine, and I was walking around doing plant inventories for habitat studies. You see a lot of tools made out of chert and obsidian. So even though we're up at fairly inaccessible country where there's hardly any trails except mountain sheep trails, you can find Indian artifacts, and I assume these are from the mountain Shoshone who like to be up high hunting the sheep. There are a few sheep traps up in this area, and being up that high, there were plants that were used by the native people. This is a plant that was used to tell the direction you're going, because this is called compass plant, and they are a sunflower that grows up facing east. They will face the rising sun. So if you're in a fog and you can't tell which way the rising sun is, you could just look at the ground and there will be hundreds of these flowers all pointing the same direction, and they will point to the direction that the sun came up, which would be east. That's why they're called compass flower. They're not edible. This plant is edible and tasty. It's called mountain sorrel, and it has a very tangy lemon flavor. So it's used to flavor up foods with a strong lemon citrus flavor. And it's good to eat. You can make tea out of it too and use it like a lemon flavor in other teas. But it's high in oxalates. So if somebody has a tendency toward kidney stones, some of the kidney stones are oxalates that can be inflamed by eating this plant. So it's not a good idea to indulge if you are prone to kidney stones. This is a sedge, an Alpine sedge. All of the sedges are edible. So at certain stages, the tender parts may be the flower head. This is in flower here. Or sometimes it's the leaves, and sometimes it's the stems underground, and sometimes it'll be the rhizomes underground. But these are small ones that are not often eaten, but they can be as a survival food. This is a very sweet tasting flower. The plant itself isn't eaten, but the flowers are eaten. And they are very pleasant. They're sweet and perfumey aftertaste. And it's called moss campion. And they start out as a small central disc, and then they expand. And sometimes there'll be a disc that is 3 or 4 feet in diameter. And the only part you eat is the flowers. Mountain sheep also like to eat the flowers, and you could see them sometimes on one of these discs just devouring the whole surface of it. So we mentioned earlier the bluebells as an edible plant with mucopolysaccharides that are healthy for your digestion because they create a prebiotic film over your intestinal lining that makes for a good habitat for intestinal flora and a healthier immune system. Well, these are the alpine version of bluebells called Alpine Bluebells, Mertensia alpinum. And they are quite delicious, just like the lower elevation bluebells. They taste like green beans. The flowers, the stems, and the leaves. So it's not only tasty, but very healthy. This is American Bistort. Trying to think of the Latin name, and it just went by me. At any rate, Bistort is in the Polygonum group, which is the buckwheats. But in this case, it is the root that's eaten. Some of the other buckwheats, we didn't look at some of the lower elevation ones. Seeds were actually collected and mixed in with other flours to make bread. So buckwheat flour was part of the biscuit root flour sometimes, which is a very healthy thing to have in there because there's an enzyme in buckwheats called rutin that strengthens the collagen in your tissues, makes your skin tighter. But in this case, although the seeds are edible, the part that was usually used is the root that's dug up on American Bistort. Polygonum bistortoides is the Latin name, just came to me. The root is kind of an S-shaped root, and it can be 2 inches or 3 inches long, and you can slice it after you clean it off and fry it in marmot fat, because there's a lot of marmots at this elevation, or some kind of marrow, and it is a very nice tasting, nutty flavored root, kind of like cashews. If you eat them raw, they can be a little bit bitter, so it's good to cook them, and you can also throw them into stew whole, like nuts in the stew pot. This is a plant called Fleabane. It's an Alpine Fleabane, and there's several different species, but they're all in the genus Erigeron. And Fleabanes are different than what's called asters. And there's one flower there. You can see actually a few flowers that haven't opened up those ray flowers yet, what we call petals, but they're actually individual flowers called ray flowers. They're the white part. And the ones that haven't completely opened yet, you could see the filaries that come up along the base of the flower. And if they're all an even height, that means they're Fleabanes rather than asters. And we don't eat those. They're too bitter to eat. But they are called Fleabanes because they repel fleas. And that's what herbal flea collars are made from. And people get fleas sometimes. So this is a plant that was used to keep fleas off of people and off of their dogs, because all of these tribes had dogs that pulled travois or were just family pets. At this elevation, it was Mountain Shoshone, the Dukadika people, that left all of these artifacts on the ground here at 11,500 feet where this grows. And they probably knew that they could get fleas off of their domesticated wolves, which they traveled with using this plant, Fleabane. Now we're up around 12,000 feet, where the mountain sheep are abundant, and there's still a tremendous evidence of people that left stone tools behind at this elevation. And I think probably they were gathering some plants while they were there, but they were probably there to hunt mountain sheep. And here Sometimes the only vegetation is lichens on the rocks, and that's what the sheep are eating here, is crustose lichens. And that's a sheep's eye view of the mountain. And now we're in the glacier country where there's nothing growing. So, end of slideshow.